Destruction! Shirts and hoodies. Available through Teespring. Link in the description.
Shadiversity.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and the recently released God of War number 4 looks very, very cool, and there's a lot of hype surrounding this game. And if you know anything about me, you'll probably, be able to predict that one of the first things I'm going to do in regards to this game is not actually play it, but analyze its combat to see how historically authentic it is, and is it even effective or efficient. But to do that properly, I'm going to have to break free of the confines of my fair studio once more, and go outside. It's time to go to do shop? No, because I'm not building something. To do fighting, to do weapony, throwing, using stuff. This time, I've prepared something special. Oh yes, a rough but, usable enough replica of his new axe. If you'd like to see a video tutorial on how I made my, replica of Kratos' Leviathan Axe, well, I'll put a link in the description below. I know that there are people who can do a far better job than me, but if you want to make something that's, decent enough, something that you could paint up, make it look a bit more pretty, and you want to do it cheap for around $40, well, the tutorial will help you out. Now, before I can start swinging this thing around and assessing Kratos' fighting style, we do need to assess the axe a little bit to see how historically accurate it is, and even if it's not historically accurate, how effective and efficient would it be as a real weapon. I'll bring up a picture of the Leviathan Axe while I reference directly to the replica in my hand, and the first question is this a historically accurate axe? Well, interesting. Yes and no. Kratos mostly uses his axe as a one-handed weapon. Indeed, he's got his flip-out shield, which is awesome. I love it, right? So he can actually do some proper shield and axe combat there. The thing is, though, real historical one-handed axes weren't actually this long. They could, but on average, most of the time, shorter. So we're looking at something about this long in reality. And when we go up to two-handed battlefield axes, they're actually longer, okay? If you look at the Dane axe and even the pole axe, the shaft, you're looking at something about this long. But doesn't this look like the standard size of an axe? Well, you're probably thinking that because the most common axe you've seen are wood-cutting axes. And in terms of length, I grabbed a wood-cutting axe shaft because it was so similar to the Leviathan axe size and shape. Though there is another historical axe that has a bit more relation to killing people, in which Kratos' Leviathan axe is equivalent in size, and we'll get there. Because that type of axe is not actually a combat axe. In terms of the real combat axes, so the classic one-handed battle axes and the larger two-handed axes, no. This is in a weird kind of mid-size. And that's just the shaft. When we look at the axe head, well, this is where we get to some interesting areas. Again, battlefield axes, for a historical one-handed axe, you're looking at the head being about only coming out to this size. There's a picture right there. And the whole reason behind that is the weight. Axes aren't actually massively heavy weapons. They're around the same average weight as a sword, except all the weight is concentrated right at the head, which means the leverage point can really tire you out. And so because of that, axes that were actually used in combat, their axe head's much, much smaller. In fact, the axe head of the Leviathan axe is even bigger than the two-handed battle axes that we see, like the Dane axe and pole axe. There is a big bonus in terms of the Leviathan axe's historical accuracy, and that is in the width of the axe head. So we're looking at how wide it is along this plane. And looking at gameplay footage and everything like that, the Leviathan Axe actually is much thinner than what you see on many video games, which I'm thrilled about. Like, have a look at this axe head from the video game For Honor, okay? It's supposed to be a big two-handed Dane axe, but look at how thick that axe head is. That's ridiculous, insane, no! Axe heads, pole axe, Dane axe, one-handed axes. One-handed axes could get a little bit thicker, it depends, but well, when you're looking at larger axe heads, very, very thin. So at the moment, the Leviathan axe isn't actually looking very historically accurate, but there is another axe in which the proportions suddenly fit perfectly. And it's not a one-handed battle axe, it's not a two-handed Dane axe, it's not even a wood-felling axe, because wood-felling axes, of course, had different axe heads. What am I talking about? Execution axes. My goodness, like in terms of length, they didn't need to be massively long because they weren't combat, so reach wasn't as nearly as a serious issue, but they needed to be long enough to use two-handed, okay, and get a good swing, and their axe heads way bigger because you needed to hit the target. Like if the axe head is smaller, much higher chances of missing your target, and when you miss your target, which did happen enough in medieval executions, funnily enough, you wanted to avoid that as much as possible. And one of the ways they avoided that is by making the axe head larger. There's one difference though in regards to an execution axe and this Leviathan axe, and it's the curve on the edge here. Execution axes generally didn't have as much as a curve. They were much straighter, so you could get a clean cut when you're chopping off someone's head on a chopping block. And on top of this, the width of execution axes actually start to approach the realms of some fantasy axe head designs and being much thicker than the Leviathan axe. And so the Leviathan axe is actually kind of a splice between an executioner axe and a real-world combat axe. And honestly, I think this suits Kratos quite well, because one, we are in the realms of fantasy, and two, Kratos is a little bit stronger than the regular human. And so if he wanted to make a decent combat axe, he probably wanted it a little bit longer than the standard one-handed axes, and go with a larger axe head that suits him fine. But this is a historical comparison that I just wanted to make so you know a little bit more about real-world historical combat axes. Before anyone asks, this is a castle fort I built with my dad for my kids for Christmas, whom we gave to Santa Claus to give to them for Christmas Day. And yes, Santa Claus exists, and he would use an axe. Now we can get to Kratos' combat, and the first thing that I need to say about historical battle axe combat is that we actually don't know exactly how they fought, because no treatises were written down, unlike swordplay and other things like that. In terms of how to fight with an axe, wasn't really spelled out. But through studying other sources of historical combat, like swordsmanship, and also experimenting, we can start to piece together the most efficient ways you would really need to fight with this axe. And the first thing I noticed while looking at Kratos' style of combat, having studied the gameplay footage in detail, is where he's holding it. Now, this is not necessarily an inefficient way of fighting. In fact, sometimes it can be a more efficient way. You see, because all the weight of the axe is situated further away from the hand, it can be really difficult to do more precise strikes. And so if you didn't need as heavy or as powerful a strike and you were more, focused on aiming, well, that's when you can hold the axe a little bit closer to its head and, do strikes like that. But they are not as powerful as when, of course, you do a big hit holding down near the end. The reason why the place in which Kratos is gripping his axe strikes me as odd is because this guy is supposed to be a superhuman, okay? In regards to getting more precise striking and stuff like that, he would easily have enough strength to hold this steady right at the base. So the question is, why is he holding it here and honestly doing his own combat a disservice, making it nowhere near as powerful as it could be? A strike where you're just holding it here cannot generate as much force if exerting the same amount of strike in both positions, here and here, can't generate as much force as when you throw a strike holding it down near the base, just doing a big whack. So my first point of criticism is his grip, okay? The Leviathan axe has the actual leather grip right here. No, it should be here. Now, if you're saying, well, he grips it here so he can then grip the base to do a large two-handed strike, well, guess what? You can actually do the same when you're holding it down and grip it there, okay? And again, a strike like this is a lot more powerful than a strike like that. You see, when it comes to real medieval weapon combat, you need to have a look at everything. Even how you grip the sword or weapon, in this case an axe, is a very significant thing. It affects the way you fight. And the next usually overlooked thing about this in video games, stuff like that, is the stance. Now, Kratos holds the axe almost outwards like this when he's going and is holding it right here. And then there are a couple of other positions in which he holds the axe as well. Okay, this is a very inefficient use of your own body's energy. I know as a superhuman, he can just tank it and do it, so maybe he can just say, I'm so powerful and strong, I'll hold my axe out here. But in reality, if you wanted to conserve your strength, okay, and fight more efficiently, you would at least hold it a bit above your center of gravity, even sometimes rest it over your shoulder. This is one of the big problems with axes. The axe's ability, a defensive capability, is absolute crap, okay? Real good defensive stances are usually where you can hold the weapon out at a distance and keep your opponent at bay. Now, I'm not saying you can't put up a good defense where you're holding a weapon in, say, something like the Wrath Strike, or Wrath Stance, sorry. And in fact, this is one of the better stances that I see with axe combat. And what you'd need to do when someone comes into attack is that you do a sweeping strike to knock aside the blow and then follow up with a direct strike afterwards. But it's about conserving your energy. And so for us humans who are not superhumans, this is something like this, or even just holding it up like this where it's balanced, okay, over the center. Because holding it up like that, a lot more difficult than holding it up like this. Again, Kratos is a superhuman, so he can hold it out like that, but I also don't think he's an idiot, okay? And so if there's any time where he does start to get tired and is getting pushed and stuff like that, he could have conserved that little bit of extra energy that he might have needed in the more difficult fights if he actually used some better stances. And so we're looking at something like this, something like this, something like that. Of course, you could hold it out like this, okay, get it ready. The problem with holding the axe forward like this is you need to bring it back for a strike, and so it makes your offensive ability, turns it into two steps. 1, 2. Where here, it's just 1, and you can counter-strike and attack a lot faster. Okay, so we've looked at grip, and we've looked at his stance. Now let's have a look at his actual strikes, okay? And this is the other thing that I find kind of odd, okay? Now, I can't assess every single move Kratos does. One, I don't have the physical capability of doing some of his attacks, like for instance, the whole head stomping, crushing, exploding skull move. Can't do it, and I can't criticize it too much. But I will speak generally on his broader combat, and it is a very aggressive berserker kind, especially when he does his big swings where he gets a big axe and does a massive strike like that. No real criticism there. When your opponent is in a vulnerable state, you can just do a big berserker hit and go like that. But there's a problem. Even with the strike I just did then, in a real combat situation, that's actually not a good strike. And so I'm going to bring this back to his first real attack that you see in the gameplay footage. Is his first attack is a big swing like that, and then his follow-up is a big counter swing. What's wrong with that, you might ask? Well, it comes down to some basic principles of physics. It is as hard, sometimes even harder, to slow down an axe once in motion than accelerating it. Especially if you have an axe up right here, you get to use gravity to help accelerate the axe into a strike, and then it's all you to stop it, all right? You don't get a gravity to help stop in that situation. And because of linear momentum, you know, more weight out over here, there's actually more force to try and stop than the amount of energy you needed to try and put in to accelerate it. Inertia can be a dog sometimes. And so with Kratos' strike, where he goes like that, he is just a beast, right? He doesn't care. He stops it. Now, of course, he could. He's a superhuman. So I'm not saying this is impossible, but it comes back to how smart is he, all right? Is he wanting to conserve some energy and fight more efficiently? Because if he is, his stance would be better. He'd be holding the axe differently, and he would not do a swing like that and stop it. One of the kind of primary ways to fight with an axe, especially if you want to do follow-up strikes, is to not fight against the axe's momentum, because you will lose. So instead of swinging like that and just stopping it, no, you swing on a diagonal downwards action and don't try and stop it. Let the momentum bring it back to down on a strike. And this kind of figure 8 attacking system is one of the more fundamental axe fighting moves. It uses far less energy, and instead of fighting against the momentum, you're using the momentum to your advantage. And in fact, just swinging around, okay? My arm is now, you know, the centripetal force, is that what I'm talking about? Because it's inertia, and you're just letting it move around, but the centripetal force thing, the thing that's holding the momentum to the center of point of rotation, is my arm. Not centripetal, centripetal. Centripetal? I don't know. And even if you're only trying to do one strike, okay, when you've got the axe like this, you can do a strike like that and just let the momentum bring it back. But even better, from this angle, swings down and then right back into position. One strike, let the momentum carry it back, and you're not fighting against it, and you're using the momentum to your advantage. Of course, the best friend to any one-handed axe in a combat situation is a shield, okay? Rarely would you ever use a one-handed axe in a historical setting regarding combat without a shield. But Kratos has a shield, which I love, okay? And so whenever he does need to do a big block, he can just whip out his big shield, do the block, and then go back for a big strike. And the way that I was talking about fighting, okay, using the axe's momentum and bringing it back into position, you can do perfectly well with a shield. So you've got your shield out in front, in defense, and then you can just do the figure 8 attacks and bring it back. And so axe combat is actually not as sophisticated or complex as sword combat, because it's a pretty basic weapon. I'm not saying it's an inefficient weapon, it's a brutal weapon, okay? But in regards to sword combat, because you're able to control the sword far more, and there's a lot more options for defense, in regards to stance, the way you strike, where you stop your strikes with a sword, there's a lot more to it. But with an axe, as soon as you get this thing swinging, all right, you can't stop it. It's going to keep going. So in regards to Kratos' basic attack animations, the first type of attacks when you do, instead of doing this big swing, horizontal swing where he stops it, it should be figure 8, use momentum, bring it back. Even this stance that I'm holding right here is a very efficient axe fighting stance because it's resting on your shoulder, you're conserving energy, you have your shield out in front, and you're ready to do a strike straight to your opponent, and it comes back, resting where it needs to be for a follow-up. If your opponent is left open after the first strike, where you go like that, instead of bringing it back over the shoulder, you can just go around with another strike, and can you imagine this, it's like a haymaker windmill of death? Figure 8, mate. There is a combat move that Kratos does in God of War that is beautifully historically accurate. In fact, it's something that I have not seen in many other video games, so it gets big points in this regard. And it's that Kratos does a realistic shield bash. In the game, you see him here, he whips out his shield and he smacks him with the edge of the shield. That is brilliant, okay? Now, regarding shield bashes, yes, you can bash forward, but that will never actually injure someone. It's very difficult. All the energy is dispersed over the face of the shield, and the boss doesn't extend too far. Sometimes they did have spikes protruding out of the boss, so that could work. More often than not, they didn't. And so the purpose of bashing with the flat of the shield is just to knock your opponent off guard. If you want to do damage, and honestly, you can knock people off their balance far better, this type of bash with the edge, so much better. And then there's another kind of bash that Kratos does, separate to the flat, bash like that, and the edge bash. He does kind of a shield slap, where he knocks someone aside. That could be done with the type of shield he is using, but with a real historical round shield, no, you would never do it. This is what would happen if you slap someone with the side of the shield like that. You slap, it hits, and then it spins like that, because round shields like this are a center grip. But Kratos' shield is actually strapped to the forward part of his forearm because it just kind of appears, flicks out from his bracer. And so because it's attached more securely to his forearm, yes, he could probably get away with a slap, like that. But in real, combat with historical center grip shields, no, you would never slap someone like that with it. Kratos does do an interesting kind of spin attack. Now, I can't remember exactly which animation it leads off of. He usually does a horizontal, but then there's another horizontal attack, or he does this big attack where the axe is now positioned behind him. And instead of stopping it and then following up with another strike, he stops, spins around and does this big swipe like that. Actually, Kratos does a lot of spinning attacks. But the one I'm referring to specifically is this one. Spinning attacks like that are a controversial subject in regards to historical combat, but spinning attacks do exist in Taekwondo, where someone is standing like this, and because the leg is already positioned behind, they can just pivot and do an attack. So there is some precedent to doing, it's hard to call it an actual spinning attack, where he's going around and doing an attack, then an attack, like a ballerina or something, though there might actually be attack animations where he does stuff like that. Of course, no, that's not historically accurate, but if you've got a super strength like that, and you just want to attack a very wide range of foes, who am I to criticize it? I'm not a superhuman. But the so-called spinning attacks, where you either attack with your leg or something like that, is really, it's like a back, masked attack, where you can pivot to do a kick. If the axe is already behind you, and the opponent thinks it's coming around here, you can easily spin around and do an attack that they're not ready for. And if you have a shield to lock away the opponent's weapon, knock the opponent's weapon, holding it at bay, if you spun around it in an attack like that, could work. Now, unfortunately, I can't speak to Kratos' wider range of moves or his more specialized moves, because in those situations where the opponent is vulnerable and then he just goes in berserker with these big hits like that and stuff, they would work, of course. I'm not saying they wouldn't, but generally his combat could be done far more efficiently. But there we go, this has been my review of Kratos' Leviathan Axe and his combat from a historical perspective and analysis. Thank you for watching, I hope you've enjoyed, and if you'd like to see some bonus, God of War-ish combat, you can check out the video where I make my replica axe right here. There's a card to it there, link in the description below. But like I said, thank you for watching, I hope you've enjoyed, and until next time, farewell. The shaft of this axe, damn birds. First thing that I noticed with Kratos' combat is a plane flying overhead. There was a plane flying overhead when I was doing my how to build this thing as well. You can hear it in some of the video. Look, it sounds like a World War II dive bomber. Get lost! Beautiful day though, not a cloud in the sky. But if your opponent is... It's hot, I'm wearing gambeson, and the shield is heavy. Farewell. Oh, gosh. I'm about to die.